break last Sunday for our annual meeting. That was a important thing to take a little break to make sure we focused our attention on that. And actually, we should see if over the course of annual meeting, while we're having this conversation, maybe some questions or something will come up about that. I think about like why we do that, how we do that. But where we left off, we were going to talk 2 Sundays ago. We were going to start getting into the constitution of the church and what it means to be a church that has a constitution. And I think, as I've described it to some of you all, people will come to me and they'll be from the Roman Catholic Church. They'll come to our worship. They'll see it feels very similar. Deeply rooted liturgical, sacramental traditions, feels familiar in a lot of ways. And so they say, well, tell us, how are you different? And one of the things people will frequently go to is they'll say, oh, well, you call your pope the presiding bishop. And I'm very quick to say, I get it, but the presiding bishop is really not quite our pope. And if I was going to make an argument for it, I would say because of the democratic structure of our church, I'd be more inclined to say our pope is more like our constitution is our pope, right? If that kind of makes sense. Well, true. Well, there's that whole, infallibility of the Word of God and all that element. And the changeability of it, recognizing we have a constitution which sort of has this authority, kind of like the authority that gets, in the sense of the authority is vested. We don't vest our authority in a person, like a pope. We invest our authority in a democratic structure that we've put together. And then we realize, then we need practical applications. Right? The Constitution doesn't actually give us any real-world examples of now how do we live this out. It provides a structure, but not. It provides I would even say it provides a foundation, but not a structure. The architect in the room is going to tell me I'm mangling this metaphor some, I'm sure. And then I would say maybe the canons of the church, which is more kind of putting together now a framework built on that foundation.
Does that differ a lot from Church of England?
It differs some in that they do also have canons, which are essentially laws, right? Canon laws. They do have laws that they come up with, but their structure is very different for a couple of reasons. One is that they do have a supreme monarch, the king, that in those kinds of ways is a little bit more like a pope historically in some ways. And if you look in their canons, there are a ton of things in their canons that will talk about bishops can't be made bishops without the authority of the monarch. It's the monarch who has the authority to appoint who's going where and to remove them, and sort of this supreme authority. And where was I going with that? And also to say one chief difference is, of course, it's a state religion. And so the secular, civic government of England is very involved in the designing of the rules and laws in a way that the United States government is not for us.
Some money into the state religion.
Although I've come to it, not nearly as much as you think. Like, you think that all the churches and cathedrals are subsidized and everything. And the cathedrals in England will say, we really aren't subsidized by the government. We're expected to perform a lot of government functions, but don't really, taxpayer dollars aren't going to keep the cathedrals running in England in that same sense. So for example, in England, they have the Book of Common Prayer just like we have a Book of Common Prayer. They have their same roots in that 1549 Book of Common Prayer. We Americanized ours when we broke away from the Church of England, right? Like we took out the prayers for the king, right? Their Book of Common Prayer is still the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, and it's never officially been updated from that time because it takes an act of Parliament to update the Book of Common Prayer. That would be the equivalent of us wanting to update our prayer book in the Episcopal Church, but we have to get Congress to do it for us. Right? So that's very different. which is why it doesn't. Which is why they still have a 1662 Book of Common Prayer. We would still have a 1662 Book of Common Prayer if we were expecting Congress to do it for us, I'm sure. So that's kind of where we left off on Sunday, 2 Sundays ago, and really didn't start getting, because there were a lot of questions about the foundations of that, and now it's an opportunity for us to start looking at some of the Constitution itself, real quick, just to see what comes up from that. I decided not to put up a QR code that you guys could zap and get the Constitution, because really it's super easy if you just do a web search for Episcopal Constitution, it comes right up. It's the first thing that comes up. So there's no trouble finding it on the Episcopal Church website. If you go, I mean, you'll see we update it. This is the 2024 edition that we updated when we got together in the summer for General Convention last year. And you get a table of contents that talks about all the various things. Lots and lots of, these are all the canons, rules and laws that we've passed. But the very first thing that's before all those canons is the Constitution. And it's a much more general document about creating that foundation that our church is built on. We'll get into all of the canons and everything very soon, probably starting next Sunday. We'll start digging into some of the canons and things. But starting for this Sunday, I thought we could just take a very general look at the Constitution real quick. I guess we should start with the preamble. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit so you all can see it. Is that a little better?
Mm-hmm.
And some of this, we're not going to get to nearly all of the details in this hundreds and hundreds of page long document. So some of you may decide you want to go at home and look through some of this for further detail. But the Protestant Episcopal Church of the United States of America, otherwise known as the Episcopal Church, which name is hereby recognized as also designating the church, is a constituent member of the Anglican Communion. Right? So we're part of that. We talked about the Greater Anglican Communion. We're a constituent member of it, a fellowship with the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and those duly constituted dioceses, provinces, and regional churches in communion with the See of Canterbury, upholding and propagating the historic faith and order as set forth in the Book of Common Prayer. This Constitution, adopted in General Convention in Philadelphia in October 1789, as amended in subsequent General Conventions, sets forth the basic articles for the government of this church and of its overseas missionary jurisdictions. Decently straightforward so far, but
Would you talk for just a minute, because I know we get asked about this all the time, why, when you say the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church, the Catholic is capital versus a little c?
right, Catholic as in this is the universal church. Right, not Catholic as in Roman Catholic. The Roman Catholic Church is a denomination that we frequently call Catholic for short, as opposed to the word itself Catholic, which means universal, all-encompassing church over all things. Right, and those are from our Nicene Creed, exactly. So you'll see some of this comes from our Nicene Creed. You should probably notice right off the bat that we drafted our Constitution right alongside with the United States drafting its Constitution. A lot of the same members were actually involved in this. Yeah, Lance.
I was going to ask, do all churches have constitutions previous to this, or was this because it was those same kinds of minds that started the Episcopal
Great
Church
question.
and they thought to make a constitution?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's exactly because it was a lot of those same kinds of minds. When our framers of our Constitution in the U.S. were separating from England and deciding, do we want another monarchy? How are we going to govern? And they said, no, we want to be a constitutional style government. And as they were drafting that, we patterned the church the same way, where we decided we wanted to be a democratically based constitutional church as well. Even in Philadelphia, because it was all happening in Philadelphia at the time, right? This is pre everything happening in Washington, D.C. There was no national cathedral yet. Did I see it? No, I
Do
didn't.
do you know who wrote the Constitution? I mean, the individuals, was it?
Oh, gosh.
Any names that we would recognize?
I
it's okay.
have looked at the names, and I feel like there are some names I think we would probably recognize. I hesitate to just jump
Okay,
out there
well,
automatically.
but we can find a search for that.
I mean, we would have expected probably people like Samuel Seabury, William White, Samuel Provost would have been some of those people that, among the ones that became the first presiding bishops of the Episcopal Church. Much in a similar way, right, to the U.S. Constitution, where some of those guys ended up becoming presidents of the United States. So there's a lot of parallel tracks here. So we have. Sorry, yes.
Was the position of the presiding bishop defined in the Constitution?
Yes, it is in here, right? So this is good. This is a good question, because we're going to have a conversation about what is a presiding bishop. Is it a pope? We have to decide, do we want to elect our own pope? So the first thing they decide, Article 1, now this is going to have articles just like in the U.S. Constitution, we have articles defining what is the legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, what do they do? We're going to do the same thing. We have a legislative branch, right? It's our general convention. There shall be a general convention. It's going to kind of act like a Congress. It'll be made up of two houses, like a Senate and a House of Representatives. We're going to have the House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. And then who's going to be in it? We have to decide who's going to be in these houses. So the House of Deputies will be made up of both lay people and ordained priests and deacons. So we want both lay and ordained engagement and involvement in government. Again, it's different. I mean, and what does it say about our church to say? We want it to be democratic. It's one thing to say we want to be democratically structured. It's another thing to say, who do we include in that democratic process? It doesn't say it in here, but I guess, for example, we might want to point out, at first we said it will include lay people and ordained people, but it was only men, right? Because at this time, 1789, like the Constitution, it was democratic, but for men, right? So just like the U.S. had to come along on that and say, we will start including women in this democratic process, the Episcopal Church has to go through that same journey, right? Let's see. In order for a law to pass in Congress, it has to pass in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? The whole, like, how does a bill become a law, right? That same deal here. In order for any new laws to pass in our church, it has to pass both the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies. So that's a mechanism of making sure there's some, we want to be a democratic process, but we want to have some mechanisms for making sure that we broadly agree on things. They will sit and deliberate separately, and in all deliberations, freedom of debate shall be allowed. You could argue they're probably taking this from some religions where freedom of debate wasn't always allowed. Right? So this is important. They're putting this in the Constitution. We shall be allowed to argue about these things, hash them out, discuss, see what we think. Either house may originate and propose legislation, and all acts of this convention, the convention shall be adopted and be authenticated by both houses. So this just section 1, article 1, right out the gate is already doing a lot to shape what the Episcopal Church will be today. How will we define what our clergy are? Will we have priests? Will we have deacons? Will we have bishops? How will this work? So section 2, there will be bishops. Each bishop of this church will have jurisdiction. Every bishop coadjutor, a bishop coadjutor, that's when we elect an incoming bishop who's going to come and be over a diocese, and they come and they sort of co-bishop over a diocese while the outgoing one leaves, sometimes for a period of a year or two. Continuity, handoff.
Like an interim priest?
Like, in some ways, except for whereas in the parishes, we really don't have that overlap. Like, the priest leaves, and then after we do a search, a new priest comes in. In this case, for the diocese, it's much more common for a diocese to elect a new bishop to replace the outgoing one and to have them in place before the other bishop goes away, so that there's not a vacancy where you have a diocese with no bishop. So that's what a coadjutor. Bishop suffragan, that's an assisting bishop, which is actually not the same as an assistant bishop. These are different terms. Bishop suffragan, they're selected in a different way, but bishop suffragan or assistant bishop are not diocesan bishops. They don't run a diocese. They are fully bishops and can do all the things a bishop can do. They can ordain, they can confirm, but they are not the ones ultimately in charge of the diocese. They're serving under a diocesan bishop. Yes, Marcia.
Sorry if you answered this already, but, so bishops come, bishops go. Who decides when a bishop goes?
Generally, when they either hit mandatory retirement or
Okay, so
choose
they're
to
in
resign.
there, it's like a lifelong position then until they choose to.
Right, there's not a term of office. Yes,
Okay.
so in that way,
Can
let's
someone
see.
throw them out if they want to? Like, can people like not think a bishop is good and?
Good question, good question. So this would be very similar to, say, the US Supreme Court,
Okay.
where when we select somebody, they are selected and it's a life tenure
Okay.
until they don't have mandatory retirement, however, which we have for bishops, could be impeached.
Okay.
You could impeach somebody in the Supreme Court. They have a life tenure, but if they were caught, I don't know, like what would be something that we would do to impeach a Supreme Court justice?
We don't know nowadays.
We don't know nowadays. Yeah.
That's a good
But
question.
there's a process. In
Yeah,
theory,
right,
and,
okay.
and the same is true for a bishop. A bishop could be removed for some sort of grave misconduct,
Okay.
but otherwise they can't just be fired. Right?
Okay.
You can't just say, we don't like the job you're doing, you're fired. It's a lifetime appointment outside of mandatory retirement, which is 72, or they choose to resign. They may not want to still be running a diocese at 72. They may say at 65, I'm ready to retire. Or they may be removed, but only under the most severe of circumstances generally does that.
So are there rules in there for impeaching a bishop or removing a bishop?
Yes, oh yeah, there's rules in here for impeachment, the same as in the US Constitution, there's rules for impeachment, right? Now we'll see putting those into practice, just like in the US Constitution. There's the document and then there's trying to enact it in reality. Yeah, Rachel?
One thing that I found, you know, we as the Episcopal Church are in full communion with the Lutheran Church.
Mm-hmm.
But the Lutheran Church, when they have elected a bishop for their diocese,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and I think they have terms, and in the Lutheran Church can be
Mhm.
up,
And there was a time the Lutherans did not have bishops for a period.
right? But once they leave the job in the Lutheran Church, they no longer are a bishop.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And here, once you become a bishop, even if you are in Timbuktu with no church at all, you're still a bishop.
Right, yes, there's a distinction between the job you're working and say I don't want to get this the wrong way, but this gets into the ontological change argument of if God is substantially changing who you are, what you are as a person, and the argument would be you stay a bishop even if you are not serving as a bishop somewhere.
Well, it's like president stays a president, whether they're
Yeah, kind of, yeah, exactly, in that kind of way. They're
not
still
in
always,
office, but they refer to him as president.
sure, that's,
But
Some of
can
I
a,
usually celebrate President's Day by honoring Richard Nixon.
well, who even after his resignation still was called President Nixon, right? Yeah.
but can a bishop that has retired and gone to Hawaii or Timbuktu or
Mhm.
whatever, when they call for the House of Bishops, they may come and they have a vote.
Yes, yeah. Even a
Where
retired bishop?
In the United States, once you retire as a president, you don't get to still have all those rights,
Mm.
votes and everything. You are a retired president.
Yeah.
Right.
And you go back to being a normal citizen until you get
Not
elected.
necessarily.
Well,
No, you still get all the papers and all what's going on, you know.
There's a salary for life,
And you
there's
still
Secret
get, you
Service
still
for
get a lot of
life.
things.
But in terms of,
Which, right, it's not exactly the
it's
same.
not exactly, no. They're not.
Well, and recently in the Catholic Church, remember, there was, and we're kind of still in the Roman Catholic Church, they're still dealing with the ramifications of when Pope Benedict resigned, but was still around, and was still telling people things, while Pope Francis was the current Pope, and it caused a lot of issues from people to say, like, I actually still want to listen to Benedict. And
That's tough.
it led to some tough issues, right? So at least in theory, you think you would want to say to the person who leaves office, please stop giving orders, you're no longer in charge. Can you tell the Pope to do that?
Yes.
They were kind of having a crisis about that a little bit. So we try to get around that through legislation. Interestingly, on the whole issue of being in full communion, part of the issue of going into being in full communion with the United Methodist Church, likewise, has been the status of bishops. Among issues is because in the United Methodist Church, a bishop is strictly a job title. It's a job that you are doing. You are an ordained clergy person that may be working as a bishop, but when you leave that job, you're no longer a bishop. The bishop is, so that's kind of like how we refer to a rector, or a curate, or a chaplain, who we may have an ordained priest that may be serving as a chaplain, or as a vicar, or as a rector, and they move jobs, but they're always a priest. That's not how they see the role of bishops. So part of entering into full communion is a little bit of a, here's what we say a bishop is. You don't exactly say the same thing. How do we reconcile that to be in communion with each other?
It's kind of weird in the Methodist Church because although they're not a bishop for life, they actually have powers they don't have in the Anglican Church or the Lutheran Church. I mean, in the Methodist Church,
Yeah.
the bishops decide, who the pastor is at the individual congregations.
Right.
And it says you can stay there for life, or I'm moving you. I think I want somebody else in
Yeah.
2 years. But, yeah.
So, like, how do we work those things out?
Called district superintendents, which are posted by the bishops for, like, in the state of Florida, that's one. And they have district superintendents, which are like over geographic. And those district superintendents are the ones who actually post the pastors.
So I assume there's rules in the Constitution on how you become a bishop, but it's not like in the Catholic Church where the Pope decides,
Yes, and we'll have, and it's down here a little bit further,
Yeah.
and if I can grab Charlie real quick, and then realize we have Constitution to get to. I don't want us to miss out
I
on
would
the
like
end.
to see how the job description of bishop varies from church to church and denomination to denomination, because I'm sure the duties and the definition of what a bishop is and what they do
Yeah.
vary greatly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and we'll talk about specifically, so what is a bishop. We defined what is a bishop and what are their responsibilities, which may be different than others. But so this said, let's see, should we talk about basically, as bishops, all bishops are members of the House of Bishops. They remain members of the House of Bishops even after they retire. There has been legislation talking about whether or not retired clergy and retired bishops should give up their vote in the House of Bishops or not be in the House of Deputies. But currently the structure is that you remain a voting member. You could probably see how that might change the outcomes of some election, of some legislation, depending on whether or not you've got 50 retired bishops that are allowed to vote on an issue or not. Let's see. This is the part section 3 talks about the presiding bishop. Somebody asked about, is the presiding bishop in here? There's the presiding bishop. What this structure basically talks about is the presiding bishop is not over the other bishops, not like a pope, can't order around the other bishops, Sean Rowe is our current presiding bishop. He cannot come to Chicago and boss Paula Clark around. Our bishop is in charge of our diocese, and in that way they're equals in that way. It's kind of like a Speaker of the House in Congress kind of sense, where the Speaker of the House is just one member of Congress along with all the other members, gets one vote, can't really order the other Congress people around, but has some additional functions, particularly when it comes to presiding over discussions and votes. In that same way, our presiding bishop has a very functional role in presiding over the House of Bishops. And then some things that get vested in the office of the presiding bishop is a very much sort of a head of state kind of way. A lot of ceremonial functions, a lot of head of state stuff. You would expect the presiding bishop to be meeting with, say, like foreign dignitaries, the way our head of state in the U.S. has that function. Now, in our case, our head of state is also our head of government and chief of staff of the military. But in this case, our presiding bishop is that kind of head of state, head of state in that function of meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the heads of the churches of Lutherans, Methodists. Currently, it wasn't always the way. That they now have a 9-year term. There wasn't always a term. In the original Constitution, it was just whichever bishop had the longest tenure. The longest tenured bishop was the presiding bishop. They eventually did away with that and made it an elected position, like we just elected Sean Rowe to a 9-year term. We don't get too far into that, but Section 4, this talks about the House of Deputies. Currently, as it's structured, we send 4 ordained persons and 4 lay persons from every diocese. So, this is kind of like in the Senate. No matter if it's a big diocese or a small diocese, the same number of representatives. In the U.S. Senate, Wyoming and Texas get the same number of senators, 2. So you could argue about bigger dioceses maybe having more delegates. That's not how it's structured in here. It's currently structured so that every diocese gets the same amount. And we have different size ones, just like the U.S. has different size states. Equal numbers of lay and ordained people to serve as deputies. This talks about majority votes, votes by orders, right? Just like in, if you've ever been a part of a legislative process, you can call for something to be a vote by order. So say something is approved, say you have legislation that is approved overwhelmingly by the priests, but the lay people don't like it. You can call for a vote by orders. It has to pass in both the lay people and the priests and deacons. And if it doesn't pass with both of those, it doesn't pass. And that's in order to make it so that the lay people can't just run roughshod over the clergy, and the clergy likewise can't just run roughshod over the lay people. You need broad consensus. Let's see, adjourning, Robert's Rules of Order, things like that. But here we go, Article 2, bishops. So this is the thing that talks all about bishops. I'm not going to spend a ton of time in this because we're actually going to talk some next Sunday about some of the roles actual clergy people do. But I just want to pause to show you. We define the role. We define the role in a constitutional way to say whether or not there'll be a term of office, what somebody has to do to be selected as bishop. There are places in other denominations where you may have, like when the Pope is selected, right? They have a conclave. You all saw the movie, right? There are cardinals, and the cardinals are the ones that get together in a room and they vote for who the Pope is going to be. Here, we don't have a secret room of cardinals. We don't have, it's not the priests that get together and get to decide who the bishop will be. We call the whole diocese together to send elected representatives, and at their convention, they will select a bishop. And, importantly, once they select a bishop, it has to go, this is like ratifying an amendment in the Constitution, where when they pass a constitutional amendment, it has to go to all the states for approval. Also here with bishops, once a diocese elects somebody to be bishop, it goes to the other diocese, and the other majority of the other dioceses then also need to approve that person as bishop. And that's to prevent, you could imagine, like a rogue diocese selecting some bishop that's really not in keeping with the ideals of the greater Episcopal Church. We don't need to get too into the weeds on it right now, but we just had that happen not that long ago in Florida, where a bishop was elected, and it was a somewhat contentious process. There were some allegations about impropriety in the voting, and they got elected, and then when it went around to all of the other dioceses, not enough dioceses ratified it, and so that person was not bishop. So again, that says a lot about our church to say it's not just what we want in Chicago. When we elected Paula Clark, it means we needed broad consensus in the rest of the church nationally that she was going to be suitable as a bishop, right?
So does the Constitution get into the weeds on how much a bishop makes and whether
Salaries and things like
bishops
that.
can compete for, a rich diocese? It's the better guy.
I will be honest with you, off the top of my head, I don't see salaries in here.
It's just interesting, how much more should a presiding bishop make than a regular bishop?
Right, and bishops do get paid different amounts in different dioceses.
Yeah.
And
It depends upon how much money is in the diocesan budget, how many churches are in that specific diocese.
bishops in foreign lands, standing committees. So this is the next thing I wanted to make sure we got to, is this article of a standing committee. I think this is important for us to understand the structure of the Episcopal Church as well. We have an elected committee. Think of a standing committee as, if this is helpful, as kind of like a vestry, or say our cathedral chapter, but for the diocese. Kind of. That's an overgeneralization, but it's similar to that in that there's a group of people who are elected usually. It's up to each diocese, I think, how they do it. So it's not in the Constitution here, say for example, it's not in the Constitution how the standing committee is selected. So that's an important distinction. In the same way that a US Constitution makes decisions, but then on areas where there's not legislation, individual states can come up with their own rules as long as they're not in conflict with the national Constitution. Same deal here. The Diocese of Chicago might come up with its rules of how we select our standing committee members. Individual dioceses come up with their own rules about how we elect members to our vestry. It does say in the national Constitution, though, they have to be elected. It doesn't say how many members. You could have 12 members, could have 15 members, you could have 9 members, depending on what your diocese allows. But the national church says they do have to be elected, though. They can't just be appointed by the priest just picking the 12 people that will agree with them. And you could, again, I think you can see that how that would also change the structure of the church. So standing committee, in this way, the important thing to remember about a standing committee, so this is a group of people who have been elected to serve on this committee who are basically, let's just read what it says here. If there be, shall be elected by the convention thereof, except in the provision for filling vacancies between meetings. When there is a bishop in charge of the diocese, the standing committee shall be the bishop's council of advice. And if there is no bishop, the standing committee shall be the ecclesiastical authority of that diocese. So, if you have a bishop and an assistant bishop, we've decided it's not like president and vice president, where if something happens to the bishop, the assistant bishop does not become the new bishop. We could have done it that way, but we decided that's not how we want to do it. What we decided was, if there's a vacancy in the bishop, the standing committee is in charge of the diocese. Practically speaking, here, the Diocese of Chicago, for example, when Bishop Lee retired, And we brought in Bishop Chilton Knudsen to come and do the things that we need bishops for, ordinations, confirmations, things like that. She was serving as a bishop. She was not in charge of the Diocese of Chicago. She wasn't running the diocese. The standing committee of the Diocese of Chicago was the ecclesiastical authority. And she was sacramentally doing the things we needed a bishop to be doing. For what it's worth, in terms of that distinction. Does that sound like that makes sense? So it's important for us to remember, in the absence of a bishop, who's running things? What's the standing committee? Remember that in case you want to be on standing committee. Ask the bishop, are they planning on retiring anytime soon? Because you might be running a diocese. Admission of new dioceses. Just like the United States has to have a process for admitting new states to the Union, right? Remember we started with 13, and now we have 50. And we have potentially other territories out there that may want to be states. There needs to be a process. We have states that have split into other states, multiple states. There needs to be a process for that. And so in our Constitution, in the church, we also have a process for how to make a new diocese. And it's a very similar process. I mean, basically, it consists of having to have an area with a group of people who want to be constituted as a diocese, and it has to go to our Congress, right? Our General Convention that has to be approved that we will admit you as a new diocese in the Union. There's a process for if there were to take a diocese and divide it up. We've done that quite a few times over the years. When we had to take the Diocese of Chicago and split it off into, say, the Diocese of Quincy, because the church got so big. And then we got to a point where, in the Diocese of Quincy, church wasn't very big anymore, and we brought it back in and made it part of the Diocese of Chicago again. So there's a constitutional process for go both ways. Thoughts, questions on that? Pretty straightforward, I think. But again, it should sound a lot like the US Constitution. There's a case for what do you do with the bishops, right? If you take a diocese with a bishop and you divide it, that other diocese then has to select their own bishop because they also need a bishop. If a diocese is formed out of parts of 2 or more dioceses, each of the bishops and coadjutor of the several dioceses out of which a new diocese has been formed shall be entitled, in order of seniority of consecration, the choice between the bishop's diocese and the new diocese so formed. Interesting. So, in order of seniority, the bishops get to call dibs on which diocese they want to be in charge of. I didn't know that till just now. That's interesting. Whenever a new diocese is formed out of an existing diocese of 2 or more existing dioceses or parts of them, the formation process of the newly formed diocese, including the adoption of its constitution and canons, shall be set forth in the canons. So they have to have a constitution. Like if they're going to be a state, they have to have a constitution. If we're going to be a diocese, they have to come up with a constitution. Interestingly, in order to count as a diocese, they have to have at least 6 parishes with at least 6 presbyters that we will frequently refer to our priests, we call them priests, who have been for at least 1 year canonically resident within the bounds of the diocese. So you can't have 6 priests go to an area just for today and say, let's make it a diocese, and then go back home. They actually have to be resident there. No carpetbaggers. Regularly settled in a parish and qualified to vote for bishop. Nor shall such a new diocese be formed if thereby any existing diocese shall be so reduced as to contain fewer than 12 parishes and 12 presbyters. So we can't just take away your parishes and reduce you so that you're not able to function as a diocese anymore. We have to be able to, if we're going to split off, we have to leave enough for there to be that other diocese.
So what are the rules for becoming a bishop to begin with? Because you've told us, it's not, there's a diocese that needs a bishop, so we need to make a new bishop. You've got bishop suffragans and assistant bishops. And, what are the rules for becoming a bishop that even makes you eligible to run a diocese?
Yeah, let's see. What do we have here? Rights of bishops. further down. As it gets into the specifics, well, again, if you don't see it in the generalization of the Constitution, that probably means it's in the specifics of the canons, is probably where it'll come about then. So we'll have to keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
Like the Constitution says that there shall be presbyters, doesn't say anything about how you select them.
Right.
But in the canons, there's a lot of specific rules about how someone is made a priest, what the qualifications are. So that will be in the canons. And I forget which canon it is, but it's in, there's a set of canons for bishops and what they need to be qualified, how they need to be trained and all that. But in the constitutional sense, it's just very much in a sense of there shall be bishops,
Yeah.
is the big point here.
So at the end of the day, though, is it the general convention or the diocesan conventions that decide we need another bishop and this would be a good person? Or, I'm just curious
Well,
how
it's
they're created.
it's going to
Yeah.
be, and I think we'll probably get to it next Sunday, but it's going to be listed in the canons
Yeah.
that we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Here's how you choose someone, and there's even rules about how many you're allowed to have. Yeah, I mean, there's the Diocese of Texas had this not that long ago. They got really big and they needed more bishops, but constitutional or canonically they weren't allowed to have any more bishops. So they had to actually make a canonical change to allow more bishops because Texas is big. They need a lot of bishops. Provinces, essentially all of the parishes, the regions, all of the dioceses are grouped into provinces. So you may be a part of Province 4, largely you may be a part of Province 5, that may be largely, the Midwest region is a province of the Diocese of the Midwest, the South is the Northeast. So they break them into regions, but you'll notice, this is it, like, not much actually happens at the provincial level, it's mostly at the diocesan level. There are some things the provinces will get together, and it mostly just says, there shall be provinces. But notice that's not where the authority is vested. Based on our Constitution. We could have, but we decided that the main authority would be vested in the diocese, at the diocesan level. Province ordination. Now we'll get into specifics in the canons, but very high level general in our Constitution, what are the requirements? And it says they need to be, in order for somebody to be made a priest or a deacon in the church, they must be examined by a bishop and 2 priests. They must be not ordained already. Useful distinction. Not be ordained in a different church, for sure, right? They have to believe this. I do believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be the Word of God and to contain all things necessary to salvation. And I do solemnly engage to conform in the doctrine, discipline, and the worship of the Episcopal Church. We don't, so in terms of how many, what rules and requirements we have, it's notable to say in our Constitution, we said, this is important to us. That you need to believe this. Let's see. What else do we want to say? If a bishop ordains a priest or deacon to minister elsewhere in the church, the bishop shall do so only in accordance with such provisions as shall be set forth in the canons. So that's an interesting thing in here. We want to make sure that bishops can't just do whatever they want. In the same way that, let's compare it to a U.S. governor of a state. Usually the governor of a state can't just do whatever they want. There's usually laws about what they can and can't do. In this same sense, we have bishops, but we haven't just said a bishop is allowed to do whatever they want. The bishop has to stay within the rules of the canons. We could have just made bishops be able to do whatever they want, like in a pope. What I say is the law. That's not how they decided to do it. And then, so we've done judicial, we've done legislative, executive, like bishops, clergy, all of that, standing committee, executive, executing the laws, and the judicial branch, just like the U.S. Constitution. We have a judicial branch. Now, just like the U.S. Constitution, if you've ever looked at the U.S. Constitution, about which sections are larger than which sections, Congress, huge section on Congress, kind of small section on the courts, right? It doesn't say a lot in the Constitution other than that there shall be courts. Similarly to this, it's not nearly as long by comparison. Basically just saying there will be courts. And let's not gloss over that for a minute. Like, that's kind of a big deal in one way that we've decided that there should be a judicial process. That we've said there should be courts for the trial of bishops. We shall have decided that presbyters and deacons shall be tried by a court instituted by the General Convention by canon. There's a court of appeals. None but a bishop shall pronounce sentence of admonition or suspension or deposition, which essentially means removing somebody from ministry, saying you are no longer a priest, as punishment for your whatever transgression that you were found guilty of in a court. A sentence of suspension shall specify what the terms and conditions are. So we've got a little bit of a Bill of Rights kind of thing going on here, where you have rights. What are the terms and conditions of a suspension? And a sentence of suspension may be remitted in such manner as may be provided by canon. Thoughts, questions about the idea of there being a judicial process?
I don't, it says, but none but a bishop shall pronounce sentence of admonition or suspension. So the bishop, it sounds like there's no court, the bishop can just remove someone.
Well, it says, so there's a court and there'd be trials, but it's kind of like the bishop would be the judge, I guess, in this case, right? So they may have a trial and they, say you've got Deacon X, we're not going to name any specific names, Deacon X is accused of having stolen money out of the church and there may be evidence of it. The bishop doesn't just go in and make someone no longer a deacon unilaterally. There is a process for which there could be a fair trial in which there would be evidence, like prosecuting and defending attorneys, and all the evidence would be heard, and there would be an outcome of guilt or innocence, and then the decision that looks like it would come from the judge, like the bishop, would decide what is going to be the term of the suspension or admonition or removal. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Wouldn't you also contact secular law enforcement?
In the case of it's actually also a legal, like, civic crime, sure. But there are things that you could do arguably that aren't illegal. Like it's not illegal to have an affair. Just as an example, it's not illegal to have an affair. It is against the rules in church if a clergy person is actively having an affair somewhere. There may be, I have had colleagues who have insisted on going to trial. They can also settle and not go to trial, again, just like in U.S. courts. Insisted on going to trial and were found guilty of breaking their vows, which is not illegal. You don't go to jail for breaking your vows. But the person was suspended from being a priest and not allowed to serve as priest in the example I'm thinking of for a period of 10 years. There was their sentence. You can't serve as a priest for 10 years. And after 10 years, the bishop declared that sentence was fulfilled and the person was allowed to start acting as a priest again. Just as an example. But the bishop does that in accordance with the laws as are set forth in the canons.
And don't we have specialists that are like ecclesiastical lawyers, and ecclesiastical judges, and things like that?
Yeah, oh yeah, there's people who specifically focus on ecclesiastical law. They know these laws and how to interpret them. We're almost at the end. And just to say, like, last thing about here, the Book of Common Prayer. We have decided that there is going to be a Book of Common Prayer. We already had one from England, but they decided, we could have thrown it out, but the Episcopal Church said, no, we want to still be people of the book and Book of Common Prayer. And they decided what will be the structure of how will we update our Book of Common Prayer. Remember, we said in England, an Act of Parliament, right? They left it to the civic government, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. We said, we will allow our Book of Common Prayer. It shall be updated to stay current. It has to pass, any changes have to pass both the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies. And like a constitutional amendment, we make it somewhat of a rigorous process to say you have to pass a change, and then 3 years later at General Convention, you have to ratify that change. So that's the whole alterations and additions. Trial use document, so we've said if we want to put something out there to give it a try and see if we like it before we change it in the Book of Common Prayer, we've done that over the years. Some of you all may remember before the 79 Book of Common Prayer, the trial use books that we gave a try, and we decided which parts we really liked and which parts we said we're kind of iffy about before we came out with a formal 1979 Book of Common Prayer.
Stephen, do you have an example of a recent or fairly recent example of a change that either was brought forth or actually made it through?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing right at the moment was we put out for trial use more inclusive language options for our prayers to not exclusively refer to God in male-only pronouns. So we had a version of prayers that came out that did not use male pronouns for God. We put it out for trial use. We got feedback from the parishes about what they thought about those prayers, and then General Convention voted, and then 3 years later ratified to say we will keep these as permanent prayers in our for our Book of Common Prayer, and now they're in permanent use.
So it didn't change? Or did it?
Well, they went to trial use. We decided we liked them and decided to keep them.
They did add the options?
Yes,
Okay.
yep.
Sorry.
And so added the options for these more inclusive prayers. So that's just like a very recent example. We put out trial use liturgy for weddings for same-sex couples because our wedding for the wedding liturgy we have in the Book of Common Prayer prior to that assumes a male and female couple. So we put out a trial liturgy that would work for any permutation of couples because they're non-gendered specific. After it was in trial use, we decided whether or not we liked it or not, and they voted to put it into permanent use, and now it's permanently one of the wedding liturgies we have in our church that we can use permanently. So, but it got voted on, right? We didn't have a pope say, "You shall now do it this way." Our presiding bishop didn't say, "You shall now do it this way." We elected people to General Convention, and we elected our bishops, who go to the House of Bishops, and then voted, gave it trial use. Then it needed to be ratified by everybody. So, very broad brush, but that Constitution, that's the foundation. And now, starting next Sunday, now we will start looking at some of those canons and start looking at, now how do we practically put this into use? We say we have bishops. Now, how do we do that? Like, to your question, Greg, like, we say we have presbyters. Now, how do we do that? So that's what we'll start getting into next. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very welcome.